You are watching a magic trick. Every time you open your newsfeed and see another headline about the Department of Justice seizing an Iranian oil tanker or the U.S. Navy intercepting a vessel carrying illicit cargo destined for China, you are being directed to look at the shiny object. The official press release will always talk about national security, enforcing sanctions, or cutting off funding for terrorism. They frame it as a policing action, the global sheriff upholding the law on the high seas. Ignore that. It is noise. If you want to understand the tectonic shift happening right now, you have to stop looking at these events through the lens of international law and start looking at them through the lens of desperate accounting. We are not witnessing law enforcement. We are witnessing the grand return of state-sponsored privateering. This isn't about morality, it is about liquidity. The United States government is quietly liquidating foreign assets to plug holes in a domestic energy strategy that is mathematically failing. But that is just the surface level. The real story, the one that won't make the evening news because it is too complex for a 30-second soundbite, is that these seizures are the single greatest accelerant for the death of the global free market. By weaponizing the energy trade so aggressively, Washington isn't just seizing a few million barrels of crude. They are forcing the rest of the world to build a parallel infrastructure, a shadow banking system, a shadow insurance market, and a shadow shipping fleet that is entirely immune to the US dollar. They think they are tightening the noose, but in reality, they are cutting the rope that tethers the global energy market to New York and London. When the U.S. seizes a tanker, it is a tactical victory. It looks good on a press release. It brings a quick injection of cash when that oil is auctioned off in Houston. But strategically, it is a disaster. It is the equivalent of burning your house down to stay warm for one night. Today, we are going to walk through the mechanics of this seizure economy, why American refineries are secretly desperate for the very oil they are banning, and how this short-term cash grab is guaranteeing a future where the West no longer controls the price of energy. To understand why a global superpower resorts to seizing cargo ships like an 18th century privateer, you have to look at the balance sheet. Let's look at the numbers that define the current American energy paradox. We are constantly told that the United States is the world's largest oil producer. This is factually true. The Permian Basin is pumping out record amounts of crude, over 13 million barrels a day at recent peaks. If you only look at the headline number, the idea of the U.S. needing to seize foreign oil seems absurd. Why steal what you already have in abundance? Here is the data point that matters. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, SPR. Over the last few years, the administration has drained the SPR to its lowest levels since the early 1980s. We are talking about a drawdown of nearly 300 million barrels to artificially suppress gas prices before midterm elections and to combat inflation. That is a frantic maneuver, not a strategic one. They sold the family silver to pay the electric bill. Now, that reserve needs to be refilled, but buying that oil back on the open market at $75 or $85 a barrel would bankrupt the budget and send inflation soaring again. Enter the seizures. In recent fiscal periods, the proceeds from seized Iranian and Venezuelan oil sold into the U.S. domestic market have quietly become a revenue stream. We are seeing millions of barrels of sanctioned oil seized under civil forfeiture laws flowing into U.S. storage. It's free oil. It costs the taxpayer nothing to acquire, other than the operational cost of the Navy and the legal fees of the DOJ. But the history here is even more critical. We are watching the disintegration of the deal made in 1945 aboard the USS Quincy between FDR and King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia. That deal was simple. The US provides security, the Saudis provide oil priced in dollars. That arrangement created the petrodollar, the engine of American financial hegemony. It meant that every nation on Earth needed US dollars to buy energy. It created artificial demand for our currency, allowing us to print money without immediate hyperinflation. For 50 years, the global energy trade was a single, integrated system protected by the U.S. Navy. If a tanker sailed from Basra to Yokohama, it was safe because the U.S. guaranteed free trade. That era is over. When the U.S. seized the Suez Rajan or the Pegasus, they sent a signal to the world that the U.S. Navy is no longer the guarantor of safe passage for global commerce. It is now a predator within that commerce. You have to understand the psychological shift this causes in Beijing, New Delhi, and Riyadh. If you are a net importer of energy like China or India, you look at these seizures and you realize that your energy security is entirely dependent on Washington's political mood. Historically, sanctions were a siege tactic. You blockade a port to stop goods from moving. This is different. This is confiscation and resale. It is the difference between a police officer impounding a drug dealer's car and the police officer driving that car as his personal vehicle. This strategy relies on the assumption that the U.S. controls the financial plumbing of the world. SWIFT, the insurance giants, the shipping registries. And historically, we did. 90% of global trade is financed in dollars. 95% of ocean-going vessels are insured by the International Group of P&I Clubs, mostly based in London and Europe. For decades, if you lost access to Western insurance, you couldn't sail. If you lost access to SWIFT, you couldn't pay. But history is not static. By overusing this leverage, by turning the plumbing of global trade into a weapon, we have forced the global south to call a plumber. The seizures are the catalyst. They are the proof of concept that relying on Western infrastructure is an existential risk for any nation that doesn't align 100% with U.S. foreign policy. We are trading 70 years of institutional trust for a few months of cheap oil and a momentary geopolitical flex. The data shows the U.S. is technically energy independent, but structurally, it is still deeply vulnerable, and these seizures are the twitching reflexes of a system that knows it is losing control. Now, let's get into the mechanics. To understand why this is happening, you need a crash course in chemical engineering and maritime law, because the devil is entirely in the details. The average person hears oil and thinks it's all the same black sludge. It isn't. Crude oil is like wine. It has vintages, grades, and chemical profiles. This is the light versus heavy problem. The United States produces a massive amount of light sweet crude. This is what comes out of the shale fields in Texas and North Dakota. It is thin, low in sulfur, and flows like water. However, the vast majority of U.S. refineries, the massive industrial complexes lining the Gulf Coast, were built decades ago, specifically to process heavy sour crude. This is the thick, sulfur-rich sludge that comes from Venezuela, the Middle East, and Russia. These refineries are billion-dollar machines designed to crack heavy molecules. If you feed them only light shale oil, they run inefficiently. They need heavy crude to produce the optimal mix of diesel, jet fuel, and gasoline. This is the great irony. The U.S. is drowning in light oil but is starving for heavy oil. So, when the U.S. sanctions Venezuela or Iran, we are effectively sanctioning the very type of oil our industrial base requires. This creates a massive economic incentive for creative acquisition. When the DOJ seizes a tanker carrying 1 million barrels of Iranian heavy crude, they aren't just taking money away from the Ayatollah. They are taking that specific chemical grade of oil and often auctioning it to domestic buyers who desperately need it to blend with their light shale output. It is a resource feedback loop. We ban the oil we need, which creates a black market, which gives us the legal pretext to seize the oil, which we then feed into the refineries that needed it in the first place. But how do these seizures actually happen? It's not usually a Navy SEAL team boarding a ship at midnight, though that happens. It's usually a paper war fought in the offices of insurance brokers. The mechanism is civil forfeiture. The U.S. government files a complaint alleging that the oil is the proceeds of terrorism or violates sanctions laws. They then get a warrant, but the ocean is big. You can't just grab a ship in international waters without causing a war. So they wait. They pressure the ship's owner, the insurer, or the captain. Most commercial ships are owned by shell companies but insured by Western firms. The moment Washington tells Lloyd's of London, that ship is carrying sanctioned oil, the insurance is pulled. A ship without insurance is radioactive. It cannot enter any major port. It cannot pass through the Suez Canal. It is effectively dead in the water. The owner, facing total loss, often capitulates and sails the ship to a U.S. jurisdiction, like Houston, to surrender the cargo in exchange for leniency. This is where the shadow fleet mechanics come in. To avoid this trap, the targets, Iran, Russia, have developed ship-to-ship STS transfers. A tanker leaves Iran with its transponder on. It meets a ghost ship. A tanker with no known owner, registered in a jurisdiction like Gabon or Palau with its GPS turned off, in the middle of the ocean. They transfer the oil. The ghost ship then sails to China, mixing the oil with other blends to disguise its chemical fingerprint. The U.S. counters this with satellite imagery and signals intelligence, tracking the draft of the ship, how low it sits in the water. If a ship leaves port riding high, empty, and arrives at its next waypoint riding low, full, but made no port calls, the U.S. knows an illicit transfer occurred. They then tag that vessel for seizure the moment it makes a mistake and enters a jurisdiction where the U.S. has leverage. It is a game of cat and mouse played with multi-million-dollar assets. But the key takeaway here is the fragility of the system. We are using the intricate laws of global maritime insurance to hijack physical commodities. We are weaponizing the fine print. And while that works for a while, it assumes the other side will keep reading from your rulebook. As we are about to see, they have decided to throw the rulebook into the ocean. Here is the twist. Here is where the law of unintended consequences kicks down the door. By aggressively seizing these tankers and weaponizing the insurance markets, Washington hasn't stopped the illicit oil trade. They have simply forced it to evolve into something far more dangerous, a completely autonomous, opaque supply chain that the West can no longer see, let alone tax or sanction. We call it the shadow fleet or the dark fleet. 5 years ago, this fleet was a nuisance, a few rusty tankers running errands for rogue states. Today, it is a maritime superpower. Estimates suggest there are now over 600 to 1,000 tankers operating solely in this shadow economy. These are massive vessels that have been purchased by anonymous shell companies in Dubai, Hong Kong, or the Seychelles. They don't use Western insurance. They don't use the US dollar for transactions. They don't use Western flagging services. By making it impossible for Russia, Iran, and Venezuela to use the legitimate system, we forced them to build their own. And they did. The irony is palpable. The sanctions were designed to give the US leverage, to turn the valve on and off. But by pushing these nations entirely out of the light, we have lost the ability to track them. We have created a hydra. We cut off one head, seizing a ship like the Suez Rajan, and 3 more dark tankers are launched from a shipyard in China to replace it. This backfire has 2 distinct phases. First, the safety hazard. These shadow ships are often old, decrepit vessels that should have been scrapped years ago. They turn off their transponders, AIS, to avoid detection, sailing blind through narrow straits. They carry crude oil without proper liability insurance. When, not if, but when one of these ships breaks apart or collides with another vessel, it will cause an environmental catastrophe. And because they are outside the Western legal system, there will be nobody to sue, no insurance payout to clean up the spill. Washington's policy has effectively filled the oceans with uninsured, invisible, floating ecological time bombs. Second, and more importantly for the macroeconomy, is the bifurcation of price. We are now seeing a 2-tier global oil market. There is the official price of oil, Brent WTI, that you and I pay for, and then there is the shadow price, the discounted oil that China and India are buying from Russia and Iran. Because the U.S. keeps seizing oil and enforcing sanctions, Iran and Russia must sell their oil at a discount to move it. Who buys it? China. This means the U.S. policy is effectively subsidizing the energy costs of its greatest geopolitical rival. Chinese manufacturing gets cheaper energy than American or European manufacturing because Beijing is willing to buy the risk oil that Washington is trying to ban. Think about that. The U.S. Navy is patrolling the seas, burning taxpayer money to enforce these seizures, and the net result is that Chinese factories get a 15% to 20% discount on their energy inputs compared to German or American factories. We are literally paying to make our competitors more competitive. Furthermore, this has accelerated the death of the petrodollar. Since these shadow trades cannot use SWIFT or U.S. banks to avoid seizure of funds, they are settling in yuan, rubles, dirhams, or gold. Every barrel of oil traded in the shadow fleet is a barrel of oil that does not require the purchase of U.S. dollars. We are actively teaching the world how to live without the greenback. We thought we were isolating the rogue states. Instead, we isolated the U.S. dollar. We created a protected ecosystem where our enemies can trade freely with each other, immune to our threats. The seizure strategy relies on the fear of being cut off from the West. But once you have successfully built a parallel infrastructure, that fear evaporates. You cannot sanction someone who has already left the building. The mechanism of control, the seizure, has become the mechanism of our own obsolescence. We are seizing the cargo, but we are losing the war. So, what does this mean for you? Why should you care if a rusty tanker changes flags in the South China Sea or if a refinery in Texas gets a shipment of seized Iranian crude? Because the bill for this geopolitical gambling is going to be sent to your kitchen table. The most immediate impact is inflation, but not the kind you're used to. We are entering an era of structural volatility. As the global oil market splits into two, the Western market and the shadow market, the efficiency of global supply chains breaks down. When you disrupt the natural flow of commodities, transport costs go up. Insurance premiums skyrocket. These costs don't disappear, they are passed down to the consumer. You see this at the gas pump, sure, but you will really feel it in everything else. Food, plastics, pharmaceuticals, logistics, they all depend on the price of energy. When the US government relies on seizing oil to balance markets or creates chaos in shipping lanes, they are adding a risk premium to every single product you buy. But the darker threat is the currency. Your retirement account, your savings, your purchasing power, it is all denominated in US dollars. The value of that dollar is heavily propped up by its status as the global reserve currency, anchored by the energy trade. As we discussed, these seizures are forcing major powers to trade oil in yuan and gold. If the world needs fewer dollars to trade oil, the demand for dollars drops. When demand drops, value drops. This means everything you import, from your smartphone to your coffee to your car parts, becomes significantly more expensive. We import inflation. The seizure economy is a signal that the US is willing to sacrifice the long-term stability of the dollar for short-term tactical goals. Furthermore, consider the blowback risk. What happens when other countries start playing by these new rules? If the US establishes that it is legitimate to seize commercial assets based on political disputes, what stops China from seizing American cargo in the Taiwan Strait? What stops Iran from seizing more Western tankers in the Strait of Hormuz? We are normalizing piracy, and the US relies on global supply chains more than almost anyone. If the seas become a free-for-all where cargo is fair game based on whose navy is nearby, the era of cheap goods is over forever. You have grown up in a world where you can order something from the other side of the planet and it arrives in 2 days for $5. That world was built on the safety of free trade. The US government is currently dismantling that safety to punish its enemies. The result will be a world where supply chains are broken, goods are scarce, and prices are permanently higher. This isn't just about gas prices, it is about the end of the abundance you have taken for granted. The doom factor here isn't a sudden crash, it's a slow, grinding suffocation of your purchasing power as the global order fractures into hostile blocks. You will work harder, earn the same dollars, but those dollars will buy less and less, all while the news tells you that sanctions are working. We are witnessing the end of the global policeman and the birth of the global privateer. For 70 years, the United States derived its power from being the architect of the system. We wrote the rules, and because we followed them, mostly, others did too. The system was rigged in our favor, yes, but it provided stability. Now, by resorting to the physical seizure of assets and the weaponization of the very infrastructure we built, we are admitting that we can no longer win by the rules of the market. We have to flip the table. This is the behavior of a declining empire, not a rising one. Rising empires build roads and protect trade routes. Declining empires build walls and raid caravans. What comes next? In the next 6 to 12 months, expect this to escalate. The shadow fleet will grow larger, more sophisticated, and more brazen. We will likely see the first major conflict where a seized tanker triggers a direct military exchange, not just a proxy skirmish. The veil of law enforcement will drop, and it will be naked resource extraction. But the real shift is psychological. The world is watching Washington cash in its credibility for barrels of oil. Once that credibility is gone, it does not come back. The BRICS nations and the Global South are not looking at these seizures as justice. They are looking at them as a warning to get their money out of our banks and their ships out of our insurance nets. We are rewiring the world indeed. We are wiring it to bypass us. The lights aren't going out, but the control panel is moving from Washington to a decentralized network that we cannot touch. The seizure of oil buys us a day of supply, but it costs us a century of hegemony. History is brutal to empires that mistake force for power. We are grabbing the oil because we can, ignoring the reality that every seizure tightens the alliance against us. The storm isn't coming. The storm is here. We just haven't looked at the radar because we're too busy counting the loot.